So hopefully now you've seen what makes Star Wars: The Old Republic so special. At the bottom line, what we're talking about is story.
Stories that
you tell stories and a real impact on the story.
are the story things.
We're putting story, the pillar of story.
The story complexities, I think, in the story, on elements of the story, their own story. Your class storytelling. Yes, absolutely. Story elements. You may want to enjoy the story of that story experience, the story.
Their deep experience in storytelling and our deep experience in storytelling. What our story looks like. Story will actually drive the story. The different stories. I think story is central. Story-driven experience to bring out kind of the stories.
Immersion.
There are two different stories to be told.
Story matches the story.
The Sith warrior story. An entirely different story.
What is the story of this place?
Huge stories. Each of the classes has their own story. Then there's the giant world story, the story side.
Storytelling.
Story with consequence.
The story that unfolds is the story you create.
A classic story.
The story, that broad story arc, you'll have separate stories.
Its own story, and that's a story that has a completely unique story.
This rich story. We want to create story that rivals
Always trying to push story, which is that story is such a fundamental thing.
Story interacts with the game. You have a lot of storytelling, story-based game, story.
And that actually alters the...
As you go through your story based on your story.
Story-driven game.
Putting great story into an MMO.
Epic storytelling we're talking about.
The storytelling.
That many stories, the type of storytelling we're doing, because our stories.
Pillar of story and character, your personal life story.
Story element. So story
Is story. With the addition of story.
This game has more story content than every single other Bioware game. Han Solo and Luke Skywalker had their own personal story. Where the story is going to go.
Giving you story.
Your personal story.
The story option.
The class stories.
Storytelling. Story-wise, has a much more action-oriented story.
We're doing story.
Republic versus Sith Empire story. The consular story, your class story, Jedi Knight class story. It's totally built for that character, for his strengths, and to progress his story. Those stories are like your own Bioware epic story. The story where there's twists to the story. And it's kind of the core of our storytelling, multiplayer storytelling.
With the storytelling, expertise that Bioware has, and the storytelling expertise that Lucas brings, the story is that it's not one story for every class. Story choices have consequences.
The storytelling aspect, your story.
And everybody's going to go, ho hum, so what? I hate game story. There's a huge difference between a good or a great story and a regular story. Right. Your story arc. And that's part of what sets Bioware games apart from other story-based games.